Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give everybody a little bit more time to log in. And we'll give them a few more minutes. In the meantime, I can just start the introductions. This is the last in the series of the Regulatory Ethics Knowledge and Support Summer Series for 2021. And we're really excited to have been able to do this summer series. And with that in mind, it's critical that everybody fill out the evaluation form, give us ideas. We'd like to start doing this on a regular basis every summer. Just getting the information out there. The goal of this series is to facilitate knowledge regarding regulations affecting decentralized or virtual clinical trials. A few housekeeping rules. If you want to submit a question for the speaker, please put it into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you don't want your username shown, you may submit it anonymously. Also, if you have any technical issues, put those in the chat and our technical people will take care of it for you. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Shaunagh Browning, who I've known for many years through the GCRC and CTSA world. She is, could I have the next slide, Winner? I just want to give her the right introduction. There we go. She currently serves as the director of the Office of Research Quality Assurance and interim director of the Institutional Review Board at Georgetown. Her work in clinical research at Georgetown began as a study coordinator in 1990. And I think I got to know you back in 1995 when you were going into nurse manager as the GCRC at Georgetown. And her work has included managing clinical research unit and assisting many investigators in the implementation of their clinical research projects. She received her BSN from George Mason in 1988, her MS in nursing from Georgetown in 1998, and her doctorate just recently in 2019 in nursing practice. Shaunagh's work has centered around the role of clinical research coordinator with emphasis on the clinical research nurse and education of staff and investigators with the goal of research quality and efficiency. Shaunagh, thank you for talking to us about remote monitoring.
Good afternoon, actually. It's not morning anymore. How are you? So I can go ahead and share my slides now.
You should be all set.
Okay. Are we seeing my slides? Priscilla, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, yes, they're there. Thank you.
Thanks for that feedback. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about remote clinical trial monitoring. And what I hope to cover is review the past, the background, and key terms for monitoring clinical trials, describe methods and considerations for remote monitoring, and discuss quality by design, which is a prospective approach to guide monitoring.
Shaunagh, could you up your volume a little bit? I'm having trouble hearing.
One moment.
I think that's better.
You can hear me better now?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So as we look at the background for why remote clinical trial monitoring has become an issue, we really have, if you just go back to clinicaltrials.gov and just look at the volume and the number of clinical trials that we're engaging with currently, you can see that we have over 3,800 387,000 clinical trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov as of August 23rd. In addition to the number of clinical trials that are growing, requiring more monitoring, there is increased complexity in the clinical trials. So this increases the number of distinct, and this really is increasing the volume that we need to monitor. The number of also distinct procedures per protocol has steadily risen, requiring additional monitoring of procedures. When we look at why there's poor data quality, so we can understand why we need to monitor, it often results from inadequate staff training on GCPs and protocol, mostly due to sudden increase or decreases in resources. So we might have staff that are leaving, high turnover rates, so you end up having problems with training. You can have poor or lack of management supervision or quality control of task completion during the study, and lack of protocol clarity leading to poor understanding of what's required. And lastly, lack of quality controls over what is collected, how it's collected and recorded for the study. So all these things need to be considered, and this is one of the main reasons that we do monitor, because we know that there can be problems with poor quality. And trust in clinical trials results. A really important part of ensuring that the quality of the data we collected is accurate and it's able to be trusted, so that we can also in turn trust those clinical trial results. There's a lot of, as we've seen with COVID recently, there's a lot of mistrust in clinical research. So it's very important that we provide monitoring and we ensure that trust. So what is the definition of monitoring? Monitoring is really the act, and this is according to ICH GCP guidelines in E6. It's the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial and of ensuring that it is conducted, recorded, and reported in accordance with the protocol, standard operating procedures, GCP, and applicable regulatory requirements. So with that definition, we want to understand what is the purpose. So really the purpose, and the number one purpose, is to ensure the rights and well-being of human subjects are protected. And then when we go back to that trust I was talking about earlier, that we want to ensure that the reported trial data are accurate, complete, and verifiable from our source documents. So we also lastly want to make sure that the conduct of the clinical trial is compliance with the currently approved protocol, the amendment with GCP, and any other regulatory requirements. So in the end, we're really looking to make sure we're balancing data quality with subject safety. Older models of monitoring relied on 100% source data verification. You come in and you check everything and say everything matches with our source, with our data, we're good. Focus of monitoring has been on finding mistakes after they have already occurred. And this tended to be ineffective, expensive, and it did not necessarily improve the quality of the clinical trial. And many of us think that with COVID, this is when really we began to look at remote monitoring. But the FDA really opened this door back in 2013 because they provided some guidance on remote monitoring in 2013. However, the regulations did not specifically, on purpose, I believe, how we conducted monitoring. They really felt that a range of approaches was acceptable, and they really opened that door for remote monitoring. Monitoring is felt to be a quality control tool, and it's really one step in ensuring quality and safety of the clinical trial, participants, and that data. And technology really should be considered in a monitoring approach. There was a study by Florence, 2020, this past year, that looked at data and what kind of data would be collected. And they said 50% of all the tests that we do during the clinical trial could be completed digitally by 2013. And this was pre-COVID, and COVID has just accelerated that. So imagine now if we did this survey again, we'd look at it and be much greater, and it'd be happening much sooner. So technology really needs to support both the sponsor, but not just the sponsor. This is not just making sure the sponsor is okay, but we also need to look how technology can support the site and not add additional burden when monitoring clinical trials. So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA has not mentioned what type of monitoring needs to be done. They left the door open for many different things. So the extent and the nature of the monitoring, really the FDA says that the sponsor needs to develop a systematic, prioritized, risk-based approach to monitoring clinical trials. And I think that's really important as we go forward. Instead of this, come in, look at 100% of my source, make sure it matches up. Let's begin to think about a risk-based approach. And the flexibility and the extent and nature of that monitoring is intended to permit varied approaches. And we really look at those approaches so that they can improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of monitoring. And again, this is from 2013. This is what the FDA guidance said then. So a risk-based approach is not less vigilant, and the FDA has made that clear, than 100% source data verification. In addition, the FDA has told us that they're really finding that there's a growing consensus that a risk-based approach to monitoring that focuses the risk to the most critical data elements and processes necessary to really achieve those study objectives are more likely than routine visits to all clinical sites. So 100% source verification is not going to contribute to that overall study quality. So designing a monitoring plan that is tailored to the specific human subject protection and data integrity of risk of the trial is important. And monitoring activities really should focus on preventing or mitigating important and likely sources of error, such as the conduct, collection, the reporting, critical data, and processes necessary for human subject protection and trial integrity. These are some of the suggested critical data points. Informed consent. Informed consent is something that when remote monitoring occurs, most sponsors and auditors will want to see. Adherence to protocol and eligibility criteria. We really want to take a look at those designed criteria that exclude individuals where the investigational product may be less safe than the protocol intended, or to include only subjects from the targeted study population for whom the test article is most appropriate. So these two things have a real big impact on data integrity and the rights and welfare of the patients. So this is an important piece of those critical data. In addition, the investigational product. We want to make sure that the accountability and administration of the investigational product is documented and handled according to protocol. And then we move into the conduct and documentation of procedures and assessments related to study endpoints, protocol required safety assessments, those that are around evaluating, documenting, and reporting of serious adverse events and unanticipated adverse device effects, and subject withdrawals and deaths. And lastly, we want to look at procedures that are essential to the integrity. That's study blinding, any referring of specified events for adjudication, or allocation of concealment, such as randomization procedures. Are those being followed, and are those being respected and not violated? So the benefits of remote monitoring can lead to a 15 to 25% in a select range of activities if these concepts are used. We can really save time. And there are several publications that are out there that suggest that certain data anomalies like fraud and non-random data distributions may be more readily detected by centralized monitoring techniques, which we'll talk about later, rather than on-site monitoring. So here's an example of the European Stroke Prevention Study. There were data on 438 patients that were fabricated at one site. And this was first detected by a statistical anomaly in the data and confirmed by a central review of blood results. It was not picked up or failed to be picked up at an on-site monitoring visit. So how do we go? We've seen, okay, what we've been doing in the past is not the best way to move forward. So how are we going to do this moving forward? What are some potential methods? We're going to talk really, I can't even believe I have fax up here, but we're going to talk about it because there are some sites that do that still. But email fax might be requested by some sponsors, access to EMR directly or screen share, use of e-regulatory platforms or other electronic file share platforms, central monitoring, a hybrid approach, and then I want to talk about directed and planned self-auditing as well as quality by design. So let's go back to what is important when we're looking and deciding how we're going to provide access to certain documents. So if we look back, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading this, but I just want to remind you all the GCP definitions. So source data is all the information, the original records. But source documents contain the source data. So they're the original documents, data, and records that contain that data. So it could be data from laboratory notes, diaries, checklists, pharmacy dispensing records, any of those kinds of, it could be photographs, x-rays, MRI images, subject files, any of that becomes our source documents. And it's important to remember this when we begin to think of how we're going to provide access and how we control that access to ensure we're also being regulatory compliant. So there's some things that we need to consider for remote monitoring. One of the first things is, how did we collect the data historically, pre-COVID? So as we move into this now, there might have been a lot of paper documentation, but how are we collecting it now? Understanding this might dictate how you're going to be able to provide remote monitoring or access to your monitors. You'll need to understand what types of source records are required for the study and how and why is source data generated. So if we look at this, really liked this guide here from Viva. It was Guide to Implementing Remote Monitoring for Clinical Research Sites. And I thought this picture was really important. And this is something we talk about often when we're auditing. You are going to collect data possibly from routine care and then data for specific research purposes. You need to understand where the data for each of those is coming from and what source it's coming from in order to understand how you will handle remote monitoring of the study. So if you look at case report forms and identify data collection requirements, you can see that you might have defined protocol-specific data collection methods. So you might use a paper or electronic source collection for your paper documents, might be an electronic quality of life questionnaire. You could have patient-reported data that could be paper or electronic. You can have calibrated equipment that might create some source data, and then investigational product tracking. And those are all specific to the actual research. But you also might be collecting some data that occurred as a result of standard of care. We see this often where we have patients and participants, somebody with a disease that is also participating in a clinical trial. So, oops. So over here, you can have EMR data. You can have, just keep wanting to scroll, I apologize that, imaging data and calibrated equipment. And in the EMR, you can be collecting demographic, hospital lab results, pharmacy, medication data from standard of care, provider notes. You might be looking at ICD-9 codes and other data within that EMR. So it's important to first outline where's the data coming from and in what form it's coming from. There was a survey conducted from October through December of 2016, and it was done through a large collaborative group to look at how many people continue to have paper source documents. And you can see, and 2016 isn't all that long ago, and I believe that it still represents a lot of what we see currently, is that paper-based methods for creating and reusing and collecting data are still very prevalent. So back in 2016, when this was done, 96% of the documentation were paper source documents. So it's important for us to remember that this will be part of our processes with remote monitoring, and how are we going to make those paper documents now available to others? So the FDA, again, going back to 2013, said, let's start beginning to rethink paper source documentation. So moving forward, as you set up processes to make yourself available for remote monitoring and making it easier for you and the sponsor, the FDA says we do encourage the use of electronic source capture. That means that we can eliminate unnecessarily duplication of data, writing it down on a paper, transferring it into a case report form. This also can then reduce possibilities of transcription errors. It can encourage entering of source data during the subject's visits where appropriate, eliminate transcription of source data before entry into a case report form, and it supports that remote monitoring of the data. And it promotes real-time access for data entry, so our sponsors can see it as we're entering it. And it can facilitate the collection of accurate and complete data. So one way that we might be seen when we think about rethinking our paper source documentation would be online measures, such as maybe a quality of life measure that you're conducting. And you might choose to do that on a tablet and do that versus on paper, so that is actually entered as the subject completes it. And you're not handing them a paper, asking them to fill out the quality of life survey, and then transferring that into a database. Have them fill it right out on a tablet or a computer, and it's being electronically entered, and there's no mistakes in entering it, and it makes it readily available for monitoring. In addition, review of EMR and enter directly into a database. You might be doing an EMR review, so you can sit there with your database open and directly entering data into it from the EMR. Your EMR is your source. You're definitely going to just directly enter that into the database. We see REDCap used at our institutions, and this is an example of the tool that is used for many trials, and that format tends to be helpful. You can create your surveys in REDCap, you can create your database in REDCap and directly enter that data in there. That's one example of rethinking paper source documentation that allows for easy remote monitoring. So remote access to data. So how is now your monitor going to access the identified sources of data? So you've gone through and you say, where are the research data going to be? How are they going to be collected? Where is the standard of care collected? Where is it going to be? And how am I going to share it now? That's what we need to begin to think about. So you begin to think about paper source documentation. Is it going to be scanned, shared electronically on a shared file? Is it going to be on an e-regulatory platform? Am I going to have redacted or unredacted data? Then you can think about things such as your investigational product. Are you going to have an original electronic report that the pharmacy provides to you? They pull out of a database and provide that. Is it some kind of paper tracking of your dispensation records? Is that going to be then shared in an electronic shared file? Or is it in the electronic medical record that somebody can log directly into, or some other system that the pharmacy has they can log directly into and have restricted access to view that information? And then you have equipment. Is there some kind of original electronic report? So if you have a freezer, can you create an electronic temperature log that can be shared? Or is it a paper log that needs to be scanned and shared in an electronic file? Or again, can we go into the EMR directly? Or maybe if it's an X-ray equipment, can we go into some kind of radiology platform and directly log into that, or some other method? So you need to begin to think about it, and all goes back to what kind of data are we collecting, how is it created, and then how are we going to access it? So if we talk about some of the ways that have been used in the past and might be used currently, You can potentially email or fax documents to share with a sponsor. It is not my preferred method. There are lots of complications with that. Most people don't have fax anymore. So I hope you're not using that. But the important thing to consider when emailing documents is how do you maintain control and accountability of the documents, especially if there is any kind of sensitive or could be sensitive or protected health information. And you also want to think about if you do have any of that in there, whether it's HIPAA compliant and such methods. This is cumbersome. This takes a lot of administrative work and doesn't make things really efficient. We can also now have access to the EMR directly, or you can do something such as screen share. So if you're going to choose to have the monitor get direct access to the EMR, you need to have good policies and protocols and language in your clinical trials agreements that helps to control that access to the EMR and put controls around it. We want to make sure that our monitors are prevented from downloading of protected health information. And we want to ensure that the restricted access to study participants by either date ranges, the name of the participants, or maybe only to a certain encounter of that participant, because that's the only thing that's relevant to that clinical trial. We have used at Georgetown, and I know others in across the nation in various forums that I've listened to, robustly using this virtual platform sharing. So you log into the EMR, your staff yourself, share your screen through some kind of virtual platform, and then you control it and you navigate to the particular data point, source data that the sponsor or monitor is looking for. So it does help control the access for the monitor to the EMR, but it is a high intensity staff time need. And we also still need to ensure the platforms we're using are compliant with HIPAA. At Georgetown and MedStar, we do have a set of policies for remote monitoring and access to the EMR that are available on Starport or the ORQA website. And I've just taken a screenshot of some of them that we have here. So all the way through the sponsor monitoring visit to restricted access for research monitors and how you get them that access to our EMR. So next, I want to talk about an Erag platform and electronic file share. When we're looking at these kinds of platforms, it's important to understand how you will maintain control and accountability of the documents, especially sensitive, protected health information. Who has access to it? How do you control access to that information? How do you share it? And where that ownership is. Is this a platform that is owned by the sponsor, or is this a platform that is owned and controlled by the site? I know at Georgetown, and I know MedStar shared the similar philosophy, is that we prefer that we have that ownership and that not get out of our control, and that we maintain that control so that we allow that view access. We also want to consider whether platforms for FDA regulated research are 21 CFR Part 11 and HIPAA compliant. There needs to be a decision from your institution, so you should always be aware, depending on where you're doing research, of what the policy is on sharing unredacted records and when this is allowed and how it is allowed. If you're viewing information, or are you going to upload information into a sponsor protocol? Scanned copies of source document also are important to remind yourself that these are not automatically what we would call certified copies. So if you're going to take an original source document, a paper document where you originally recorded it, and you're going to scan it up into a shared electronic file, those are not necessarily become certified copies. Your department would need to outline a procedure and a process by which you say that you are verifying and certifying that these electronic copies are the same as your source paper files. So it's important to understand that piece of it. So these uses of Erag platforms or electronic shared files really can be helpful for management of regulatory documents such as 1572, delegation logs, CVs, lab normals, and training. when we use these, we can have ongoing management, and your monitors can have access to those as needed and as you allow them, so that they're not coming in and viewing it after you've gotten far into your trial. And they're doing this at the start of the study. So they're actually able to monitor this then at the beginning and say, do you have all your regulatory stuff in order up front, set up to be compliant from the very beginning? Electronic systems also allow for direct monitoring of, as I mentioned, regulatory compliance, and then paper source documents created for study-specific purposes, as we said, could be certified and uploaded for viewing as well. So benefits for use of remote monitoring are many, but I've named a few here for you. And I think it's important, though, to remember when you are looking at what kind of technology you're going to use for remote monitoring, whether it's a box file share or other kind of file share, you need to make sure that you're thinking about whether this is, the system is a site procured or a sponsor procured system. So is the sponsor telling you you need to upload documents in their system, or is this a system that you have at the site? There could be some benefits to having a site procured system that you use for all of your trials, meaning you have a similar system and policies that's consistent across all of your clinical trials, instead of a one-off based on each sponsor requirement. And that can be really important for consistency and compliance at the site. But technology really does help improve remote access. It's efficient communication from the site to the sponsor, and you really are tracking study progress and compliance real time instead of waiting until you've gotten 10, 20, 30 patients into your clinical trial, have a monitor come out and discover errors that occurred early on in the trial that could have been fixed instead of waited until they've already occurred. And there's also, when you're using technology, automatic document routing within and between systems. So if you have really good technology at your institutions, the systems will talk to each other, or within the system, you can route it to different people for signatures. And as I mentioned earlier, it's helpful for standardization of process and workflows. Anytime we can do that, we can improve compliance. So central monitoring, what does central monitoring mean? And I think an analogy that I've seen in the literature that's useful is if we think about it, a central lab versus a local lab. So the use of electronic systems to monitor the progress of the study is done centrally, just like all your labs would go to one lab that runs all of your tests versus done at each of those individual sites. So when you have site monitoring, you're going to each of those individual sites. Central monitoring, somebody in one location is looking at all the sites. Monitoring can begin at any point during the trial process. And again, as I said, you're viewing all sites and you're viewing them in real time. And what's typically employed are statistical methods, and they can help trace discrepancies in the monitored or unmonitored data. And they're going to look for outliers. This data point is really off. It doesn't make sense. Let's go in and look at that and decide. Or you begin to see a series of discrepancies, such as those that we talked about earlier, where there was central monitoring that discovered fraud at a site because there were numerous outliers. So after, and the other benefit is you identify those outliers, you go in, you look at those outliers, and then you begin to think, what is the root cause? What is the problem here? What's the commonality? And once that root cause is explored and discovered, you can take corrective and preventative actions, and they can be taking place immediately. We're not waiting until we get further down the road of this clinical trial. We're taking action immediately to improve or change those outcomes. In reality, most people will use a hybrid of all of these methods that we've just discussed. So you would use e-regulatory or file shared platforms. So you might have paper or source that's generated for study-specific measures. You could have monitoring of regulatory documents and pharmacy documents. So those could be done via the Erag platform. So your monitor would say, I need access to your study in your Erag or shared platforms. and you're going to give them access to certain paper source documents that you've scanned and certified, or you're going to allow regulatory document review, or you might be able to upload pharmacy reports and other things. And so they can access that, and they might actually do that before they start even looking at cases. And then you can have direct access to your EMR. So source documentation that was collected in your EMR, where there might be standard of care, those can overlap with research. They can monitor those directly in the EMR, either through direct access or your shared screen. In addition, if you're uploading informed consents into your EMR, this helps also provide access to that critical data point of informed consents. The only time that this wouldn't be possible is unless that informed consent and that disclosure of somebody participating in research is not being shared for privacy reasons, for either a stigmatizing or sensitive research, such as genetic diseases, such as Huntington's disease, or maybe it's a study on drug withdrawal and or addiction issues where you wouldn't want that to be otherwise shared. So those informed consents may not be uploaded into the EMR, but it can provide easy access to one of those critical data points. And then some people use it and they actually scan some of the specific research test scores under the research component in the EMR that allows them to keep everything uploaded there. So you might have a hybrid again where you've done the ERAG, you've done some remote access, but you're going to have them come on site occasionally. So just because you've got remote monitoring processes in place doesn't mean that the sponsor will not ever come on site. There may be times where they will come on site to do a certain review of on-site practice spaces or equipment, or they actually want to look at the pharmacy. That's one of the things that we see most often. They want to actually see where the drug is stored, see how it's being managed. We have worked around this also by virtual platforms where we use the camera on a phone, walk around, able to show the monitors that information. And that was used highly in the times of COVID. But as we move forward and we begin to open up, we might see these combinations where they'll come, but they'll come less frequently and only review those things that they absolutely have to on site. I want to present something else to you that I found interesting in the literature, is something called directed or planned self-auditing. Many institutions use this for monitoring of clinical trials and sponsors of large federally funded clinical trials. So you could have creation of an electronic self-audit tool, and that's going to focus on those high critical data points that we talked earlier. So you're going to focus on those risk areas around safety and data integrity. Your teams are then taught how to use these tools, and these tools are shared with a central monitoring or auditing entity. So typically they're an electronic tool, they're completed, and they're submitted to the central monitoring or auditing entity. And those entities will look at this as part of their quality management plan, look for outliers, look for problems and trends. And this really helps reduce the frequency and cost of those monitoring visits and make sure that there are quality control measures in place. And this is especially useful for, This is especially useful for multi-site clinical trials where you have some remote sites. I've seen this used in sites internationally. And here's an example of the effectiveness of this plan. This was a study done in 2019, and it was titled Self-Audits as an Alternates to Travel Audits for Improving Data Quality in a Caribbean, Central, and South American Network for an HIV epidemiology study. And so in this study, they had self and travel auditors. And these auditors both reviewed similar patient charts, and they reported 93 and 92% of the 8,919 data entries captured across 28 unique clinical variables on 65 patients that they were entered correctly.
So data audits from the study, they found that these data audits, these self-data audits, could provide an alternative to on-site to ensure data quality. So they were able to find that these self-audits were as accurate as the on-site audits, and they were able to reduce the number of on-site audits that were needed based on this data. Okay. Next, I just want to mention quality management, and this is really a perspective approach to setting yourself up to ensure monitoring is effective and efficient when done remotely. So a quality management plan is a system that includes defined quality requirements for your study. It's site procedures, forms and templates. What are your quality control measures? Maybe you're going to be doing some self-auditing. What are your quality assurance measures? What are your corrective and preventive action processes and continuous quality improvement activities that support standardization, data accuracy, completeness, and data integrity? One of the methods that you'll see in the literature now is something called quality by design. And quality by design is really a risk management approach. And that's where that quality is built in. So as you begin to look at clinical trials, I think we're going to be seeing a shift to this so that our remote monitoring is focusing on key risk indicators in the data. And that's those quality indicators and those important points that we discussed earlier, the critical data points. So event rates, number of protocol violations, query rate, % of patients with dose reduction. So you're looking at important points in the clinical trial, key risk indicators. Where are the things that you're most concerned that things might happen, or you could identify things going wrong in the clinical trial? And assessment is really part of an ongoing trial design and recruitment to results. So when you use this quality design method, you're taking corrective actions much earlier than you do when you're just doing routine source data verification monitoring. So in this particular work by Laudre, they said that trial quality is really defined as the avoidance of errors that matter to the decision-making. So we're human beings. We're all going to make mistakes. We will transcribe data from time to time wrong. We're going to choose the wrong data point in the EMR to put in the case report form. This happens. But what we really need to do is figure out how we're going to avoid errors that matter in the decision making. And monitoring now is repositioned as a tool for evaluation and improvement, and not one that we're just looking for those errors to say that we found errors. So when you look at quality by design, quality in clinical trials is defined as the absence of errors that matter. Again, those that matter. So our focus and our effort are errors that matter for the success of that particular trial. What are those outcome measures? What are those key indicators? And we're taking actions to make sure that those critical factors are not going to negatively impact that clinical trial. So it's important to understand the data, the processes, how we're collecting the data, so that we can understand how to improve those clinical trials. Everything we talked about, outlining what data is being collected, where it's coming from, and how it's going to be collected and managed. So how does quality by design really improve clinical trials? If we go back to those two things I talked about, monitoring and the purpose of monitoring, we're really looking at protecting patients during the clinical trial, and then how we obtain reliable results so we can really trust those clinical trial results and make sure that they're meaningful information. So quality by design really helps organizations become prospectively and fully aware throughout the life cycle of important errors that really could jeopardize this. So we look at this when we're setting up ourselves for monitoring. That's an important piece. So this is a really well-known quality improvement model, is the plan, do, checked, act. And this is what is used when using quality by design. You build a plan that is quality into your clinical trials from the beginning on focusing on what matters most. And then you implement the study risk management strategies. You check by making sure that we are really collecting those quality, those really important parts are being collected and they're accurate. And then we act by, if they aren't, we assess it and we are going to fix it as needed. So we're really looking at mitigating the risks that will likely lead to errors that matter and determine how we can rapidly identify and react when there is an issue. And so as we work with our monitors and we look at those things that we're doing, let's make sure that we have those key areas ready for remote monitoring using a variety of approaches. Lately, undue emphasis has been placed on data accuracy when in fact reliable results can be obtained even from imperfect data. So we really need to focus on those things that are really part of the key quality indicators and those critical data points, instead of wasting time, effort, and administrative burden on things that may not impact that clinical trial. So I wanted to leave time for questions. So I've got a few minutes. We've got about 10 minutes left. Any questions at this point?
Shaunagh, this is Priscilla. I do have one question, and that relates to what is your experience with getting sponsors to accept the site-centered e-platforms for reviewing and monitoring?
So I think that we've seen a tremendous proliferation of e-regulatory platforms right now. They're all vying to get you to purchase their platform, and there are sponsors that are wanting to dictate their platforms. I believe that we won't have any problems with that as long as it's accessible and easily accessible to them, and it meets their needs to get the information they need and monitor successfully. That I don't think that we'll have any problems doing that. I think what we do is we have more problems when we don't have a standardized approach at institutions and each sponsor becomes a one-off, and then the sponsor starts controlling where they want the data to be because we aren't providing them that access. And then we get into more problems and questions regarding compliance with HIPAA, sharing of data, who has control and accountability. Did that answer your question? Yeah,
it did. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions out there? If you have them, put them in the Q&A. If not, I want to remind everybody to fill out the evaluation that will be in the chat. The link to it will be in the chat in a minute or two, I think. Also, I would really like to thank Shaunagh and all of our presenters who have made this summer series so spectacular and so educational. And I'd like to thank the REKS team who from MedStar, Howard, Georgetown, and the VA for all of their hard work on pulling this all together. And hopefully we can do this again soon, probably maybe not until next summer, but that's where the evaluation comes in. It's critical that we get your feedback. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the Q&A, but I thought that was very, very helpful. And we at the VA also have our own remote monitoring procedures that we need to follow for the.
Terrific.
So, yeah,
terrific.
I think it's key.
It's absolutely key that you have those policies in place at your institutions. And I think that we'll see, and I've spoken to several large institutions, Duke, Vanderbilt, Inova Health Center, and they're all moving toward purchasing their own e-regulatory platforms because they want to have that available. So that definitely are working towards that.
Right. It's something to keep in mind for the not too distant future, for sure. But thank you again for your time and effort in this series.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's it. The survey is in the chat. Please, please do the survey. Okay. And I think that's it. We'll keep everybody posted if we should have another series coming up, and we will inform everybody. And thank you again for everybody for joining in.